continuing tracing the argument through 1 Timothy, and we come now to what is undoubtedly the most controversial passage in the entire letter, because it contains Paul's statement in 1 Timothy 2 verse 12, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man." This passage is almost all of the debate hinges around that issue, and there are a couple of debated points. Firstly, is this an eternal command, or was it a contextual command? Was Paul talking about all women throughout the duration of the church age, or was he talking specifically about a situation in that local church at that time? The second big question is whether the entire chapter of 1 Timothy 2 relates to a church service. In other words, all this talk about praying and behavior, is Paul talking about what happens in a church service, or is he talking more generally about what happens in the community of faith? This has a meaningful impact potentially on how we understand the passage, and I'll draw some attention to that as we go. Now, it's crucial to understand that the diagramming method that I'm using doesn't constrain interpretation. It doesn't tell us what the passage means. The diagram reflects the fruit of my own study of the passage. In other words, if I interpreted the passage differently, I would probably diagram it slightly differently. There's not only one right way or one plausible way to diagram a passage. Anyhow, without further ado, let's have a look at 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 8 to 15. As I see the passage, it divides into 4 sections, and each section follows what we can call a topic comment structure. So it's got a topic comment structure. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that there's a topic and then something is said about that topic. A comment is made about it. In each case, the topic is a constituency within the church that Timothy is leading. The first group is men, and the instruction to the men is to pray. The next group is women, and the instruction to them has to do with how they adorn themselves, how they dress, how they behave, and particularly wants them to dress modestly. The third is to a woman. Now, do you notice the switch? This is plural, and this is singular. So we've got to switch from plural to singular. Some interpreters would say this makes no difference at all, and others would say this is critically significant. I'm in the latter group. I think the switch is significant. The Greek word for woman can equally be translated wife, and similarly the Greek word for man can be translated husband, much like in Afrikaans where man could be man or husband and vrou can be woman or wife. So if you speak other languages, many languages have the same idiosyncrasy. So as I see it, the third group he turns his attention to is wives, and the instruction, the comment to them is let them learn. We often miss that. We're so hung up on how they learn and what they're not allowed to do that we miss the countercultural claim here is let a wife, or if you think it's a woman, let a woman learn. And then the fourth group is this group they, and the comment to them is that they will be saved if they do something. Now, who's this they? Well, there's a she and there's a they, and then an instruction given to them. And the question is, who is she and they? Well, my main reason for arguing that this means wife is because I think the she is pointing back to the woman here. The reference is to childbearing, and the they, if that is correct, must refer to the husband and wife paired together, i.e. to a married couple. So if we follow that logic, then we could outline the passage something like this. In verse 8, we have instructions to men. In verses 9 to 10, we have instructions to women. In verse 11 through 14, we have instruction to wives. If this woman here, remember, could refer to a wife, and then the man would be the husband. And then lastly, in verse 15, this probably will go behind my head. So verse 15, we have instruction to couples. So I'm going to unpack it on that assumption. realizing that you may take a different view. So firstly, Paul addresses the men, and the action that he asks them to perform is to pray. Now that might give the impression that Paul's saying to you, prayerless men, you need to start praying. That's almost certainly not what the issue was. The real issue is the manner in which they pray. They must pray lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. So the issue was not that the men were not praying. The issue was that they were praying but also fighting with one another, quarreling. And so Paul's point is, let there be peace and unity so that when we come before God to worship Him, we do so with the right heart, with the right attitude. Next, he gives instructions to the women as a group. And once again, we have action and manner. The action Paul exhorts, so he has to the women, and it has to do with how they adorn themselves. So let the women adorn themselves in a respectful apparel with modesty and self-control. And then he starts to unpack particularly exactly what does that mean for godly women in their community, and he's going to give some guidance on that. Particularly, he's going to tell them what it shouldn't look like and what it should look like. So there's a negative, this not with braided hair, with gold, pearls, and costly attire. And most likely what's going on here is that you've got women from different economic groups in the church. Some can afford fancy jewelry and clothes, and others are poor and they can only afford very rudimentary clothing. And Paul doesn't want the church to be divided along economic lines between those who have plenty and those who have much less. And so this is not the place for women to be showing off their wealth in a way that potentially shames their sisters in Christ. But, so how does a woman adorn herself? So we're still talking about manner. The manner should not be with expensive clothing, but it should be with good works. So this is the appropriate way, says Paul, for a godly woman to make herself attractive. Let's move on, talk about the next section. So now we're talking, in my interpretation, let a wife learn quietly, which I base mostly on verse 15, and also on the assumption that it's not clear that we're talking about a church service. So if these commands are given in the context of a church service, then we must understand it as a woman. But if it's understood as instructions for the Christian community, then it's perfectly normal to give instructions for the relationship between a wife and a husband. Anyhow, be that as it may, there's a big idea here. And the big idea is that a wife or woman should learn. This is countercultural. It's liberating. In many of the spaces of the day, women were precluded from opportunities to learn, for education, for development. And so Paul is saying, let a wife or a woman learn. And then he gives some instructions about the manner in which she learns and what she is not. And depending on how you take the text, you might say what she's not yet permitted to do, namely to teach or exercise authority over a man. And then he explains this, or perhaps gives what we might call the grounds or basis for it by pointing to Adam and Eve. So this word for can refer to either an explanation or a grounds. Let's unpack each of these ideas a little bit. So verse 11 tells us, let a woman learn, and then, so that's the main thing, right? The topic is woman, the instruction, the comment is let her learn, and then there's a manner instruction with quietness and submissiveness. And then he amplifies that. So he further expands. This is a short version. This is a longer version with more information that goes beyond the original. And he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority. Some translators would argue that means to usurp authority over a man or over her husband. Rather, she is to remain quiet, not totally silent, but quiet of disposition. And there's huge controversy around these verses. I'll let the commentaries unpack them further. But as the argument unfolds, he now explains this instruction and he grounds it in Adam and Eve. And there's two parts of that. It has both to do with who was formed first and to do with who was and wasn't deceived. So he grounds his recommendations in verse 11 and 12 in the order of creation and the nature of the fall and deception. Lastly, we turn to the couples. So here we are looking just at verse 15, and there's two parts to this. There's a consequence. So talking to couples, he says she, which I believe refers back here to the wife, she will be saved through childbearing. Saved means, in this context, then spared. And this is the main reason that I think the context is not a church service. I mean, what on earth are we talking about she being saved through childbearing if we're talking about what happens in a church service? The verse 15 just is horrendously confusing if we assume that the context for all these instructions is appropriate conduct in a church service. Giving birth in a church service is probably not considered ideal and certainly doesn't happen too often. So we've got this reference to she being saved, and I presume the Greek word certainly can mean spared, healed, protected, etc. through childbearing. If this is a wife, then they have to do something in order for this to happen. They have to continue in faith. So this then would refer to the husband and wife together. And this makes perfect sense. The rest of the context of 1 Timothy, there are several indicators that some of the ladies were scared to have children. They were withdrawing from childbearing. And so Paul's exhortation perhaps to the believing community is to say a wife will be spared through childbearing. There's a promise of God's protection and assistance if the couple, instead of refraining from following God's encouragement to have children, if they believe and continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. And that, in essence, brings us to the end of this whirlwind walk through the argument of 1 Timothy 2, verses 8 to 15. My own journey with this text has been in something of a state of flux for the last couple of years. So I've been grappling with it, almost vacillating to and fro between interpretations. So it's quite possible that if you hear me on this in a few months' time, I may have moved again. But at least right now, I would see Paul giving instructions to 4 groups. Husbands, pray with holiness. Women, adorn yourselves with good works, not with fancy clothes. Wives, learn, but treat your newfound freedom to learn with humility by being submissive and not demanding authority. And couples, if you trust God and have children in that spirit, you will be saved through childbearing. Hope that's helpful. If you disagree, that's okay. We can agree to disagree.